Dr. Anthony Fauci is not America's doctor. Dr. Anthony Fauci was never an expert in the epidemiology of lung disorders or a pathogen of respiratory origins. Dr. Fauci was a $191 billion economic black hole of a failed enterprise to attempt desperately over the course of his entire tenure at the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Disease, a desperate effort to find a way to vaccinate the world against HIV. And $191 billion later, Dr. Anthony Fauci failed. He's not America's doctor. He's actually a puppet. And he is a stooge for a much darker story of the hijacking of America and the world's definition of health. In 1984, when Dr. Anthony Fauci took over the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases as its director, he began what at the time was a few $100 million exercise, where at various points in time he would attempt to diverge from his obsession with HIV and sexually transmitted diseases into areas of influenza vaccine. In his own words, in his annual reports, which are a matter of the congressional record and the public record, Dr. Anthony Fauci was seeking an elusive effort to find a way to, and I'm quoting, imprint on infants a universal influenza vaccine, something that would be a Wunderdrug that would allow a manipulated form of infant humanity to be imprinted with a vaccine that would carry with it his definition of what health was, his definition of what life was. And as recently as his annual briefing to his staff in September of 2019, on the very same eve of his illegal gathering of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, the organization of the World Health Organization, which in violation of the Sherman and Clayton Act's laws against interlocking directorates, Dr. Anthony Fauci sat not only with his own criminal conspirators, but with foreign conspirators to conspire against the United States. In that same month of September 2019, Anthony Fauci made no reference in any of his presentation to coronavirus. He made a passing acknowledgement that he had spoken at a conference where he talked about the ills of Zika virus and SARS and Ebola and all of these other things. He had no expertise. Or did he? The public record of Anthony Fauci is one that says that it was all about AIDS and influenza. It was all about shoveling $191 billion of United States budget into the hands of his market-selected, preferential loyalists in industry and in academia. But there's another side of Anthony Fauci that seems to suggest that maybe there was something else going on. Maybe the HIV and influenza thing was a cover for something more insidious, because in 1999, he funded the chimeric and recombinant research that took coronavirus from rabbit cardiomyopathy. And you heard me correctly, the little fluffy bunnies. Cardiomyopathy. To first introduce the amplification of spike proteins on coronavirus to start developing ways in which they would be more attractable into lung tissue, amplifying the S1 spike protein and the ACE2 receptor. Dr. Ralph Barrick and other co-conspiring researchers funded by none other than National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease and none other than Anthony Fauci. They began a process in 1999, which mysteriously involved researchers that were both at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and in China. The two locations that mysteriously also seemed to be the place where SARS, just a few years later, had its first outbreak. Dr. Fauci lamented, along with Dr. Ralph Baric and others, that the public wasn't interested in SARS enough to justify funding, but that didn't stop them. And in 2003, after the CDC illegally patented the genome of the SARS coronavirus isolated from humans, which, by the way, fact checkers routinely say is not the case, despite the fact that the patent on the genome itself includes all nucleic acid sequences associated with the sudden acute respiratory syndrome. In other words, it is impossible to have a SARS virus and not be subsumed within the CDC's patented definition of what the coronavirus that they patented really was. But that hasn't stopped anyone, because in 2005, it became very evident that this wonderful virus could actually be manipulated and amplified in ways that could harm humanity. And beginning in 2005, an allocation of approximately $1.7 billion per year was funneled through the hands of none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci for projects that actually were not competitive grants. They were not competitively bid. These were appropriations. These were market allocations, another criminal violation of the Sherman and the Clayton Act of the United States. Antitrust violations of interlocking directorates, antitrust violations of market allocations, antitrust violations of price fixing, antitrust allegations of the setting of non-competitive pricing, both for research and for the drugs that were developed and the research tools that were developed from this illegal activity, all of them managed by Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Anthony Fauci is not America's doctor, any more than Al Capone was America's banker. He, in fact, was and remains an individual who has a list of crimes, and I mean that in the literal sense of the word, list of crimes that would actually make Al Capone blush. Would he have had 25% of the $748 billion that has been granted to the NIH during his tenure? Would he have had the nearly $200 billion of disclosed funding? Al Capone could have done some real damage, but he was no Anthony Fauci. And Anthony Fauci had the audacity, against the backdrop of everything we've lived through over the last 4 years, of the craziness of allegations of people lying to Congress and lying to the public and doing all sorts of malfeasance. Anthony Fauci had the audacity in October of 2020 to lie to Congress again. How? Well, Congress was starting to ask questions. Where did all of that $748 billion of money go that went into the National Institutes of Health? To say nothing of the black projects and the special access programs that we've been able to uncover that have Dr. Fauci and Dr. Fauci's foreign parties also identified. That money, we have no idea what its scale is, but what we do know is that in October of 2020, when Congress asked the hard question, what's become of all this money? The answer was a lie. In the 21 patents listed by the Department of Health and Human Services GAO report to Congress, only 8 of the 21 legally comply with the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, in which investigators who receive federal funds have to disclose the nature of those funds, and they have to disclose the U.S. government's interests in the resulting intellectual property and technology. 8 of the 21 disclosed actually have a compliant disclosure within the patent filing. 13 fail to disclose, in violation of U.S. law, fail to disclose the U.S. government's interest. And that only leads to a few $1 billion a year of lost revenue for that little oversight. But let's take a look a little deeper, because it turns out that there are 40 patents associated with drugs that currently are actually grossing in the market, according to Medicare and Medicaid statistics, respectively $2.3 billion a year, $456 million a year, $500 million or more per year. These drugs that are actually in the market derived from 40, you heard me correctly, undisclosed patents that were never mentioned in the GAO report to Congress, never mentioned in any disclosure of any financial performance or any financial benefit flowing back to NIH. 40 patents generating somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $5 billion per year, many of them for now over a decade, never once disclosed to Congress. Now, maybe that's an oversight. Maybe Dr. Anthony Fauci is, in addition to not being America's doctor and being a failed researcher in HIV vaccines and his failed aspirations to go after the infant imprint on a universal influenza vaccine, in addition to all of his other epic failures, maybe he's a bad manager. Maybe he doesn't know how to keep track of billions and billions of dollars of research. And I guess when you've been handed $191 billion and you've squandered all of it, maybe we shouldn't be surprised at a few billion missing here and a few billion missing there. Or should we be concerned? Well, the answer is that when the media of the United States, when public health authorities, when governors, when heads of state around the world are relying on an individual who has habitually lied since 1984, who has habitually hidden evidence, who has habitually made repeated statements that are false and misleading. When you have that individual sitting at the helm of an organization charged with protecting and safeguarding the health of humanity, it's helpful to realize that Dr. Anthony Fauci is not a crusader for humanity. He's a crusader for a very dark story, where he has appropriated the work of the National Science Foundation, not only not NIH, not only not Department of Health and Human Services, he's appropriated the work of the National Science Foundation to actually come up with a way to regenerate life on Earth. Now, last time I checked, we have life. We have it, and it's working. So one has to ask the question, why would Dr. Anthony Fauci lean on a company called Moderna, a company that was started in 2010 by an escapee from one of those National Science Foundation grants, a National Science Foundation grant that had the following title, Darwinian Chemical Systems. The National Science Foundation grant that was charged with figuring out how to start living systems from scratch. Don't take my word for it, take theirs. Their goal, to enable RNA to form in protocells without a primer template strand. Dr. Anthony Fauci is not just not Dr. Jekyll, not just not Mr. Hyde. Dr. Anthony Fauci is the front man for a view that says that we, the people, are expendable in the pursuit of the self-interest of the moneyed elite and the moneyed few. And we, the people, can see in his own words, in his own hand, and in his own evidence that Dr. Anthony Fauci is committed to the destruction, not the advancement of human life. Anyone who is willing to rob the dying of their privilege of dying with loved ones, anyone who is actually willing to say that holidays shouldn't be celebrated, anyone who believes that humanity should in fact rebreathe the air that they're rebreathing for the insidious objective of ultimately getting to pulmonary pathogens, which in 2020, at its annual meeting, the NIAID decided to fund a project on fungal infections caused by respiratory distress. Your mask is not protecting you. It's getting you ready for Dr. Fauci's next experiment.